Today, President Clinton took part in a ceremony naming the State Department's headquarters after President Harry S. Truman. Also participating were Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, former administrative assistant to President Truman, George Elzey, and Missouri Congressman Ike Skelton. The event runs about 45 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, accompanied by Secretary Madeleine Albright, Representative Ike Skelton, John Truman, George Elzey, and James Earl Jones. Ladies and gentlemen, our national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Great job. Thank you so much.
Mr. President, Madam Secretary, members of the Truman family, members of Congress, distinguished guests, and members of the State Department community. It is my pleasure on this day to introduce a distinguished roster of speakers to mark the naming of the Department of State headquarters after Harry S. Truman, our nation's 33rd president and one of the greatest leaders of the greatest generation. We gather to honor the legacy of Harry Truman because he changed the course of history in America and throughout the world. He did so by summoning the will and marshaling the resources of this great country to promote democracy and fight for freedom around the globe. And his vision for America's participation in the world extended to everyone, even a young man from Arca Butler, Mississippi. In 1949, I entered the University of Michigan with the intention of studying medicine. I was also inspired by President Truman to serve my country. For in July of 1948, Truman had signed the executive order that changed my life and the lives of countless others. It proclaimed, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." And thanks to that order, I left the U of M with 2 bars on my shoulders, a second lieutenant in the Army's infantry, and part of the first generation of officers of color to serve in the integrated military. Truman's decisions to integrate the armed forces and later the civil service told America and the world that our fight for freedom abroad required the courage to share freedom's blessings at home. One of the men responsible for the courage and honesty of President Truman's foreign policy pronouncements is with us today. After working as a naval aide to President Roosevelt and serving this country at Omaha Beach, George Elsey joined President Truman's personal staff as administrative assistant and foreign policy advisor. In that role, he worked on the president's major public addresses on foreign and military policy. He was involved in the president's decision-making on issues as monumental as thwarting of NATO, the recognition of Israel, as well as the desegregation decisions I mentioned earlier. Mr. Elsey has had a distinguished career since then, including as president of the American Red Cross from 1970 to 1983. Please join me now in welcoming Mr. George Elsey.
Mr. President, Madam Secretary, members of Congress, Mr. Truman, distinguished guests all. It was my good fortune to have served Harry S. Truman throughout his presidency, and thus it is a special pleasure to join with you in this dedication ceremony. I have been asked to reminisce a bit on my experiences with the State Department in those long-gone days. Actually, I preceded President Truman to the White House by 3 years. In April 1942, as a young Naval Reserve officer, I was assigned to the map room, the precursor of today's Situation Room. One of my responsibilities, together with selected colleagues, was to be the secretariat for Franklin Roosevelt's top-secret communications with Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, Chiang Kai-shek. We also kept the records of summit conferences and other important papers relating to military and international political affairs. With our private codes, we were the link between Roosevelt and all the government for classified messages whenever he left Washington. These duties gave me an unparalleled opportunity to observe the relationship of the President and the Department of State. During the war, to an extent scarcely believable today, FDR generally ignored the department. The secretary was not invited to summit meetings, although in one notable case, another cabinet officer was. We were under strict orders to share copies of the Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, Chang cables with no one without FDR's personal approval and an okay that he never gave as far as state was concerned. Only very late in the war, when so much of this high-level traffic dealt with political matters having enormous post-war significance, was this firewall of secrecy breached. Admiral William D. Leahy, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, thought the situation was intolerable. So, at his invitation, the State Department's resident expert on Soviet affairs, Charles Boland, would come quietly to Leahy's office in the East Wing of the White House. He would be shown there the messages that Leahy had told me to assemble for Boland to peruse. The Admiral would then give the papers back to me for map-room safekeeping. Boland would walk back across West Executive Avenue, where the department was in those days, to brief from memory his colleagues who had a need to know. An incredible and inexcusable state of affairs. All of this changed on April 12th, 1945, when Harry Truman so unexpectedly became president. He made it clear at once that nothing would be withheld from state. I was directed to show the prospective secretary, James F. Burns, any of our map-room files that he wished to review. Now, my meetings with Burns were clandestine because this was many weeks before there was any announcement that he was going to replace Edward Stettinius as secretary. Burns, a former senator and Supreme Court justice, had been Roosevelt's director of war mobilization. In that post, FDR had left Burns alone. "Let Jimmy do it, don't bother me," were the marching orders. So when confirmed as secretary, Burns proceeded to act as Secretary of State, just as he had been accustomed to act as war mobilizer. "I've been given a job, I'll do it, I won't bother the boss." And so, ironically, the former situation was now reversed. It was the Secretary of State who was keeping the president in the dark. Burns spent much of late 1945 in Europe struggling with British and Soviet representatives trying to settle issues that had been left unsolved at the July summit in Potsdam of Truman, Churchill, Attlee, and Stalin. In late December, Burns cabled from London, ordering the department to arrange nationwide radio network time so that he could report to the American people. There was just one problem. He hadn't bothered to report first to the president. The day he returned to Washington, there was a blunt face-to-face confrontation. When Truman was blunt, Truman was blunt. Burns thereafter scrupulously kept President Truman informed of his activities. Burns was succeeded by General George Marshall, a man whom Truman greatly admired and always spoke of in effusive terms. Under Marshall's leadership, State Department creativity was unleashed and flourished. You know the results. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, they're just three of the many State Department initiatives that shaped the post-war world. Despite holding radically different views on Israel from Truman's, Marshall's loyalty to his president never wavered, and Truman's respect and admiration for Marshall never faltered. Dean Acheson followed Marshall, serving all 4 years of Truman's second term. The warm personal relationship of these two strikingly different personalities has become legendary. During bleak days of McCarthyism, the who lost China argument, and the Korean conflict, Truman and Atchison stood solidly together, each strengthened by the other. By Atchison's time, I had long been out of naval uniform and was a member of the President's civilian staff. That staff was incredibly small compared, Mr. President, to the White House bureaucracy of modern days. Truman's staff could gather comfortably in a semicircle of chairs around his desk for a regular 9 a.m. get-together. We weren't even a baker's dozen. Some of us were jacks of all trades, handling each day the assignments passed to us. More often than not, my tasks dealt with presidential speeches, messages to Congress, and policy papers on foreign and military matters. In another stark contrast with the President, there was no White House speech and message staff. We looked to the department or agency most concerned for early drafts. I especially welcomed Atchison's opening all doors here at State. It made for easy working relations. Madam Secretary, I don't know about the literary style of the department today, but I can testify that the papers that came out of Foggy Bottom in those distant days a half-century ago needed some translation. We of the White House staff most assuredly did not make the policies spelled out in the State Department drafts of presidential foreign policy speeches, but we surely were editors of those policies. I spent many, many, many hours translating your department's prose into understandable Trumanese. Mr. President, Madam Secretary, on behalf of my former colleagues of Truman days, too few of whom are still with us, I thank you with all my heart for the honor you are paying to the man of independence, Harry S. Truman.
Great remarks, sir. Thank you so very much. I wish you'd just talk for another hour and let the rest of us listen. It's fascinating.
It is my great privilege now to introduce John Ross Truman, who knew the President as Uncle Harry. John was very close to his great-uncle while he was President. The President wrote his grandnephew often from the White House, and John was a regular visitor, including to the newly renovated White House when John was 11. John and Harry Truman kept up their close relationship when President Truman returned to Missouri. John is here today on behalf of the Truman family to share some thoughts and reminiscences. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. John Truman.
Mr. President, Madam Secretary, members of Congress, distinguished guests and friends, I want to express my great appreciation on behalf of my wife and the entire Truman family for including us in this special day. My great-uncle believed in government, and he believed in the power of the United States as a force for freedom and prosperity in the world. So he would have been proud of the men and women who conduct America's foreign policy in this building, which will bear his name. You see, President Truman cared about names and the honor attached to them. In a letter to me as a boy, he told me I was the fifth John Truman, and he instructed me to wear that name with the honor that his father had worn it. So I know he would have been very proud and humbled by the step you are taking today to memorialize his good name. Of course, to those Trumans who grew up in Independence, Missouri, President Truman was known simply as Uncle Harry. And Uncle Harry was the honest, plain-spoken embodiment of Uncle Sam. Indeed, Uncle Harry was the kind of man every child could look up to, because he always spoke his mind and he always tried to do right. In fact, his favorite quote is a maxim that Trumans have always tried to live by. Always do right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest. I can tell you that Harry Truman would have been gratified to learn that anything as important as the headquarters of our nation's diplomacy would be named in his honor. On behalf of all Trumans everywhere, thank you for this lasting recognition. It is an honor my family will always cherish, and an inspiration to the stewards of the Truman legacy. May American leadership in the world always be strong and always stay true, just like our Uncle Harry.
Our next speaker was present at the creation of the legislation to name this building in honor of Harry S. Truman, together with Representative Roy Blunt and the entire Missouri delegations of the House and Senate. He deserves great credit for the unanimous passage of the Truman Dedication Bill, which President Clinton signed into law on June 20th, 2000. Congressman Skelton is the ranking Democrat on the Armed Services Committee, and he has represented the 4th District of Missouri since 1977. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Ike Skelton.
Thank you so much. Mr. President, Madam Secretary, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we are at the State Department to fulfill the provisions of legislation naming this building in honor of our 33rd President, Harry S. Truman. I was pleased to introduce this legislation in early February, and I was especially delighted that the bill moved quickly through the House and the Senate. Let me take this means to thank President Clinton, Secretary Albright, Missouri Congressional Delegation, General Donald Dawson, Ambassador Philip Kaiser, and those other Americans who, through their efforts, have made this wonderful occasion possible. A special thanks go to my fellow Missourians, Congressman Roy Blunt, Karen McCarthy, for co-sponsoring this measure. Earlier this week, I spoke with President Truman's daughter, Margaret Truman Daniel, and she expressed her regret that she would be unable to attend today's dedication, but she asked me to pass along her most sincere greetings. I came to personally know President Truman through my father, Ike Skelton Sr., who developed a friendship with him some 72 years ago at the dedication of the Pioneer Mother Monument, the Madonna of the Trails statue, located in my hometown of Lexington, Missouri. Later, I developed my own friendship with this genuinely nice person we call the man from Independence. Here in the District of Columbia, there are over 20 buildings and monuments and bridges named for past American presidents. Until today, none of these structures has carried the name of President Harry S. Truman, who was undoubtedly one of the most illustrious occupants of the Oval Office. President Harry S. Truman was bedrock American. He was a man of strong character who held a deep regard for his country and for the American people. President Truman was greatly devoted to his wife and lifelong sweetheart Bess and to his daughter Margaret. He learned about hard work and the value of a job well done while growing up on a Missouri farm. His integrity and honesty were never questioned, and his loyalty to his friends was enduring. And in turn, Truman inspired loyalty in his friends and staff that remains to this very day. It's especially appropriate that this department, which administers U.S. foreign policy, bear his name. It was, after all, Harry Truman who, during a critical period in American history, guided the United States away from our established pattern of peacetime isolationism in order to assist European economic recovery and security. Truman launched the Marshall Plan and established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, under which much of Europe remains protected today. Harry Truman displayed significant courage in standing up to the communist aggression that marked the beginning of the Cold War. Indeed, Harry Truman's commitment to the democratic rights of free people established the United States of America as the most pivotal instrument for good in this world. At this time, at the dawn of a new millennium, our nation must build upon the legacies of President Truman, especially in the field of foreign policy and American leadership. It's my hope that the dedicated public servants who work here at the Harry S. Truman State Department building will recognize the true greatness of Missouri's favorite son and reflect the highest American values that characterized President Harry S. Truman. The current occupant of the State Department's highest post certainly embraces the American values and love of country that President Truman championed. Since being sworn in as the 64th Secretary of State, she has worked tirelessly to reconnect with the American people and our foreign policy. Through my work in Congress, I've come to know the Secretary as an extremely able leader and a sincerely delightful person. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you the woman who gave such encouragement for my effort to name this building after Harry S. Truman, the person who has stood for American interests and values, and one who always returns my phone calls, the Honorable Madeleine Albright.
Thank you very much, Congressman Skelton, and I once again congratulate you and Representative Blunt and our colleagues, everybody, for the commemorative legislation that you introduced and enacted. I just wish all our dealings with Congress were so successful. In any case, you should be proud, for this is a truly great day for the State Department and a great day for Missouri. Mr. President and members of Congress, excellencies from the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Truman family, George Elsie and James Earl Jones, distinguished colleagues, guests, and friends, this is a truly wonderful afternoon, and so welcome to you. It is no secret that this ceremony has a very special meaning for me. Harry S. Truman was my first American president. Because of his vision and that of his generation, I have been privileged to live my life in freedom. Today, we link in symbol what has long been linked in spirit by stamping the home of American foreign policy with the name of one of its greatest architects. No one understood better than President Truman the importance of effective diplomacy as a complement to America's economic and military strength. He understood the goodness of American power. He was a doer whose plain words and bold actions mended a broken world, saved freedom, and embodied the principles of our nation at its best. It is fitting, therefore, that we gather in tribute to Harry S. Truman today, and that we are led in doing so by the man I am about to introduce. When President Clinton took office, He confronted a world in which the signposts that had guided us since Truman's generation had disappeared. The lessons learned from the past had to be applied in new ways. America could quite easily have retreated, refused to take risks, and turned its back on hard problems around the globe. Instead, for almost 8 years, President Clinton has had the strength to hold the 20th century alliances together and the vision to respond to 21st century threats. He has helped to create a world more free than it has ever been, restored America's international economic leadership, engaged China and Russia with firmness and wisdom, responded with success and guts to security threats in the Balkans, East Asia, and the Gulf, led on human rights, including the rights of women and girls, and made bold progress with our allies towards a Europe without walls, wholly at peace and fully free. In an era of complexity and constant change, President Clinton has brought America into the new century strong and prosperous, and helped to make the world more democratic and just. That is truly a remarkable record, and it is a remarkable honor for me to introduce to you now the President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Secretary Albright, thank you for your remarks and your leadership. My longtime friend Ike Skelton and the other members of the Missouri Congressional Delegation, thank you for this great gift to America and to our children. John Truman and the members of the Truman family, we welcome you here. We are honored by your presence. And I'd like to say a special word of personal thanks on behalf of Hillary and myself to Margaret Truman Daniel for her uncommon kindness and concern for the First Lady and our daughter for nearly 9 years now. We were thinking about her in what has been a hard year. And I was telling John Truman when we came out here that Margaret came to dinner with her late husband several years ago at the White House, and I rather cavalierly, along with Hillary, had her to dinner in the private dining room on the second floor. And I did a little research right before she came and discovered that that had been her music room when she was a young lady living in the White House with another first family that had only one child, a daughter. And so I asked her, I said, Margaret, how you like this dining room? And she said, well, Mr. President, I like you, but I really don't think people should eat on the same floor they sleep. And I felt as if I were in the presence of Harry Truman all over again. So I dutifully got down my well-worn copy of David McCullough's great biography and then looked at the houses of Harry and Bess Truman in Independence, and sure enough, they were two-story houses where the bedrooms were on the top floor and the dining room was on the ground floor. I want to say to you, Mr. Elsey, I wish you'd just taken the whole program. I could have listened to you for another hour and a half. And I think I speak for all the people in this audience in saying that we are grateful you are here to provide us a living account of a remarkable time and a great president. And we are grateful for your service to America as well. We thank you, sir. And I want to thank James Earl Jones for being here, and also for his friendship to me over these years. I was so hoping before I knew he would come that there would be an African American in this place at this time who could be the living embodiment of the remarkable steps Harry Truman took that put us on the road we still travel today. You have made quite a showing in your life, Mr. Jones, but I can't help thinking that in more modest and less famous ways, there are hundreds of thousands of others whose lives were also encouraged and advanced by Harry Truman's courage. And we thank you for being here today to embody that. Most of all, I would like to thank our Foreign Service and Civil Service employees who are here, who work every day to advance our interests and values around the world and to make us more free and more secure. This is a very good thing we're doing today. Listen to this. In 1956, at the close of his visit to Great Britain, the London Daily Telegraph called Harry Truman the living and kicking symbol of everything everyone likes best about America. That's a pretty good reason for putting his name on the State Department. But it really doesn't even get into the top 10. For history will credit Harry Truman for creating the architecture of post-war internationalism in politics and economics, for drawing the line against communism and for democracy, setting us squarely on the trail of freedom we continue to blaze today, for leading America toward increasing prosperity and racial equality here at home, and for laying the groundwork for pioneering achievements in meeting America's health care needs, even though he paid a dear price for it. We are still blessed because President Truman understood the importance not just of winning the war, but of building the institutions and alliances that could maintain the peace. What a job he did. The United Nations, NATO, the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin Airlift, Korea, and the Marshall Plan. Oh yes, he was committed to military strength, but from the very beginning, he knew the peace could not be maintained and the Cold War could not be won by military power alone. He told the National War College, behind the shield of military strength, we must help people improve the conditions of life to create a world in which democracy and freedom can flourish. That's an argument he had to make over and over and over again. I can identify with that. In early 1947, the House cut in half President Truman's request for funds to prevent starvation and disease in occupied Germany and Japan. He knew he had to turn that mentality around, but he believed he could. He would often say, I trust the people, because when they know the facts, they do the right thing. So when he went before a joint session of Congress to call for emergency aid to keep Greece and Turkey from falling into the communist orbit, he put it this way. The United States contributed $341 billion toward winning World War II. The assistance I recommend amounts to little more than 0.1% of that investment. It is only common sense that we should safeguard this investment and make sure it was not in vain. With the leadership and support of like-minded members of Congress, the bill was on his desk in 2 months, passed by overwhelming majorities in both houses. And he fought the same way to win America over to the Marshall Plan. Harry Truman's unmatched insight allowed him to see emerging patterns in history, to identify new challenges over the horizon, and to build the institutions and approaches to meet them. Thanks in no small measure to President Truman, we have won the Cold War and now must shoulder a like responsibility for meeting the challenges of a new century and a new era in human affairs. With global interdependence growing daily, creating ever new opportunities and new and different vulnerabilities, the need for U.S. leadership in the world has never been greater. The need for building on Harry Truman's legacy has never been greater. But the old American pull of isolationism, or at least in this age, cut-way-backism, is still there. We should remember what he said. Lasting peace, President Truman reminded us, means bread and justice and opportunity and freedom for all the people of the world. My fellow Americans, this is a great day, and this is a good thing. But we should do more than dedicate this building to Harry Truman. We should rededicate ourselves today to fulfilling his vision in the new century. To paraphrase what he said so long ago, it means we have to put a small percentage of the resources we put into winning the Cold War to work in the world and keeping the peace, advancing global prosperity, reducing poverty, fighting AIDS, battling terrorism, defending human rights, supporting free press and democracy around the world. We need to move forward with debt relief for the world's poorest nations, to give them the lifeline they need to fight AIDS and educate their children and become better partners for us in the world. These are the kinds of investments Harry Truman proved decades ago could keep our soldiers out of war. If we do not want to overuse our military, we must not underfund our diplomacy. I believe if President Truman were here today, he would tell us that if we truly want to honor him, we should prepare for the future in our time as he prepared for our future in his. Those of us here today know that that means not only investing in foreign affairs, it also means investing in the capacity of our own people at home. Truman once said the success of our foreign policy depends upon the strength of our domestic policy. Well, he tried it, and it worked. By the close of his administration, he had helped to create 11 million new jobs. Unemployment was at a record low. Farm and business incomes at all-time highs. The minimum wage had increased. Social Security benefits had doubled. 8 million veterans had been to college on the GI Bill. And our country had moved closer to one America across the lines of race that divided us. In 1947, President Truman was the first president ever to address the NAACP. His biographer, David McCullough, called it the strongest statement on civil rights heard in Washington since the time of Lincoln. President Truman said, "I meant every word, and I'm going to prove it." And so he did, desegregating the armed forces and the federal civil service and continuing to fight for civil rights gains. He also envisioned a new system of health care for the elderly and affordable health insurance for all Americans. He led America on the first leg of a long march that would end in 1965 with the creation of Medicare. He endured vicious attacks, and his party lost to Congress in a record way, in no small measure because he simply thought that people, when they needed a doctor, ought to be able to get one. But at the signing ceremony for Medicare several years later, the guest of honor was Harry Truman. President Johnson gave him the very first Medicare card and said it was really Harry Truman who planted the seeds of compassion and duty, which have today flowered into care for the sick and serenity for the fearful. So at home and around the world, if we truly wish to honor President Truman, we will do in our day what he did so brilliantly in his. See clearly the long-term path we must follow. Take the first steps without hesitation. This is a kind of time Harry Truman must have dreamed of at the end of World War II, at the dawn of the Cold War, in the bitterest, bleakest days of the conflict in Korea. An America at peace, with prosperity, social progress, no crippling internal crisis or external threat. Like our victory in World War II, this opens a whole new era for us. It gives us great opportunities, enormous challenges, profound responsibilities. At home, we have the chance and the duty to meet the challenge of the aging of America, of the largest and most diverse group of school children in our nation's history, of families struggling to balance the obligation to work with the more important obligation to raise their children well, to explore the far frontiers of science and technology in a way that benefits ordinary Americans and protects our most cherished values, to get this country out of debt for the first time since Andrew Jackson was president. Around the world, we have to face the threat of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, narco-trafficking, the persistent, enduring ethnic, religious, tribal, and racial conflicts that grip so many places in the world, and new and different threats that could profoundly affect us all, including global warming and the rise of AIDS and other infectious diseases, along with the breakdown of public health systems around the world. But we're well positioned to deal with this, thanks in no small measure to what Harry Truman and his generation did so long ago. He gave us the opportunities we have today. It's a good thing that we say thanks, Mr. President, by naming this building for him. It would be a far, far better thing if we would follow his lead and give the same set of opportunities to our grandchildren. I pray, God, that we will. Thank you, and God bless you.
Give you 2 beats.
Are you guys out of the flowers over there? Pick up your... You can't be fully right or left. Ready? 1, 2, 3.